Hello and welcome back to Bioclass Bites. In this video, we are going to talk about sexual reproduction. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. These are the unit and lesson titles in this video playlist, but in this video, we are going to focus on sexual reproduction. Here are some important things to know about sexual reproduction. It always involves two parents. Okay? So if you still remember, in asexual reproduction, there's only one parent. In sexual reproduction, we need two parents because these are the two contributors of the genetic information for the offspring. Okay? So in sexual reproduction, organisms produce offspring through fertilization, and that occurs when an egg cell and a sperm cell join together to form a zygote. The cells that combine in sexual reproduction are called sex cells or gametes, and the females are the ones who contribute the egg cells, and the males are the ones who contribute the sperm cells. Okay? So we see here a typical visualization of sexual reproduction. So what happens here is that the sex cells, egg and sperm, are considered haploid cells. It means that they only have one set of the chromosome set. Okay, they have one of the chromosome set of that organism. So, for example, in humans, okay, our complete chromosome set is made up of 46 chromosomes. So that's two sets of 23 chromosomes. So 2 times 23, 46. However, for haploid sex cells, a sperm cell only contains 23 chromosomes, only half of the genetic material. The other half will come from the egg cell, which is made up of still 23 chromosomes. So once the egg cell and the sperm cell, haploid sperm cells and egg cells unite, one egg, one sperm, through the process of fertilization, they will now form a diploid zygote, a complete human organism at this point. Okay, half of the genetic material will come from the mother, the other half of the genetic material will come from the father. So that diploid zygote will undergo mitosis, and then that will lead to the creation of the rest of the body, except that will undergo mitosis, except the still egg cell or sperm cell. Okay, so all the cells in your body are diploid cells, lung cells, brain cells, muscle cells, skin cells. All of the cells in your body are diploid except your sex cells. So if you're a female, your egg cells are haploid, so they undergo meiosis, haploid. The sperm cells, if you're a male, your sex cells are sperm cells, they are haploid, they undergo meiosis. Okay? So the reason why they undergo meiosis is to actually reduce the chromosome number so that your haploid sex cells will eventually meet another haploid sex cells in the future to undergo fertilization and create a fertile diploid zygote. Now, here are the important things, okay, that eventually, we have to note about sexual reproduction. Again, half of the DNA will come from the mother, half of the DNA will come from the father, okay? So we've seen this already, that all the cells in your body are actually diploid cells. They have two copies of the genetic material, except the egg cell if you're female and the sperm cell if you're male. They are the only haploid cells in your body. They are the ones who only contain one copy of the genetic material because they are in anticipation. They are anticipating that fertilization will occur in the future. So it will eventually give rise to a diploid zygote. Now, that diploid zygote will undergo mitosis to create that zygote, embryo, fetus. Then it will be given birth to a baby, an infant, which will grow up and become another adult organism. Okay, so that's the typical sexual life cycle in animals. So our genetic material, half of it came from our mother, half of it came from our father. Now, this one is very important. Okay, this is one of the strengths or advantages of sexual reproduction. Due to genetic variation, individuals within a population have slight differences from each other. And you can actually see that within your family. If you have siblings, even if both of you or all of you came from the same parents, you are not clones of each other. You still have variation within the family. Okay, perhaps you have different height, but you share the same skin color, or you have the same facial features, but one of you is shorter, or the other one has curlier hair. Okay, so there's variation within a family. Imagine the variation within a population, within the entire Philippines, and then magnify that variation with all the human race, okay, present in the world right now. So because of sexual reproduction, there are variation within a population, and those variations, for some random chance, okay, can actually enable that organism to survive in the harsh environment, that allows them to survive in their physical environment and reproduce and pass on their genetic material. So this is actually a very important concept when we go to the topic of evolution, because only through sexual reproduction does evolution actually is driven. Okay, so sexual reproduction is one of the driving forces of evolution. Those differences within the population actually chooses or allows which organism to survive, reproduce, and pass on their genetic information. Okay, so again, no, we've been repeating this. In sexual reproduction, this involves two individuals, since two parents are contributing their genetic material. So the egg comes from the female, or okay, the female or the mother, that's the female gamete. It is a haploid cell. It only has one copy of the chromosome set. Then the sperm cell is the male gamete. It will come from the father. Again, it's also a haploid cell. It has one copy of the chromosome set. Now, through fertilization, through the union of egg cell and sperm cell, it will create a fertilized egg cell, a diploid zygote, wherein it has a complete copy or two copies of each chromosome. Now, to learn more about fertilization, I recommend that you watch this video from Nucleus Medical Media entitled Fertilization, and I'll provide the link in the description below. Now, we will look into the different forms of sexual reproduction in plants and animals. The first one would be plants, okay? So plants reproduce sexually, okay? They can reproduce through vegetative propagation asexually, but they can also reproduce sexually. Now, their ability to reproduce is actually one of the distinguishing characteristics of the different groups of plants. So these are the major groups of plants. You have your non-vascular plants called bryophytes. The examples of those or representative organisms are your mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. You will see this in the life cycles. Then you have your seedless vascular plants. We call them pteridophytes. And these are your horsetails, ferns, and club mosses. So this is one group of plants, another group of plants. You also have non-flowering plants, which we call them gymnosperms. So these are your cycads and conifers and ginkgos. And then the last group of plants are flowering plants, which we call angiosperms. So those are your monocots and eudicots. To give you an overview on sexual reproduction in plants, I recommend that you watch this video from Fuse School entitled Sexual Reproduction in Plants. I'll provide the link in the description below. The first group of plants that we will study would be non-vascular plants. So these are your mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. Okay? So the life cycle of a typical moss, which is our representative organism, okay, of bryophytes. So that's the group of these non-vascular plants. So the majority of the life cycle is in the haploid stage. And we've mentioned that haploid stage, they only have one copy of the chromosome set, and that's the gametophyte generation. So the leafy gametophyte is photosynthetic, while the smaller sporophyte, which is produced on top of the gametophyte. So this is the gametophyte plant, okay, the gametophyte plant, and the sporophyte is the spore producing, okay, structure. It sits on top of the gametophyte, is not photosynthetic, and is nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte. Now, one thing that you have to note as we go through the discussion is that non-vascular plants are highly dependent on water to carry the sperm cell to the egg cells. Okay, so these are images of mosses. So this is the gametophyte body, the common one that we see. As you can see, they're quite, they're quite a short plant, okay? Because they are non-vascular. They do not have xylem and phloem that will allow them to grow a little bit taller. Because they need to be closer to the ground, they need to be closer to the soil to get all that water. So this is the gametophyte stage. So gametophyte stage. And what grows on top of it would be the sporophyte stage, okay, sporophyte part of the plant. So these are the spore producing part of the plant, okay. Now, so one thing, that we have to note is that the acidic oxygen poor conditions produced by sphagnum, which is a non-vascular plant, can actually preserve human and other animal bodies for thousands of years. So sphagnum can actually preserve humans. So as seen here in the Tollund man, so this is actually a mummy, a mummified human. Okay, a bog mummy dating from 400 to 500 BCE. Okay, so that's how old it was. But the mummy was preserved because of the acidic and oxygen poor conditions produced by sphagnum, a non-vascular plant. So these are other examples of bryophytes. So liverwort, Marcantia. Okay, so the microscopic sporophytes. Okay, here. So actually they're microscopic, but what we can see here is the gametophyte. So the microscopic sporophytes are formed by fertilization within the tissues of the umbrella-shaped structure that arise from the surface of the flat green creeping gametophyte. So this is the gametophyte, and then the spore-producing microscopic sporophyte is found on top. This one is hornworts. Okay, so these are the gametophyte, the one at the bottom, then growing on top are its sporophyte. But this time, these are photosynthetic. They can produce photosynthesis, mostly for hornworts. That's where we can see it. So let's look at the life cycle of non-vascular plants. So let's start with the production of the egg cell and sperm cell. So we all know that these are the gametophyte part of the plant, gametophyte plant of mosses. Now, on top of them, okay, antheridia and or archegonia form at the tip of the gametophyte shoots. So they form at the tip of this, So antheridia, that structure at the tip, is the one that produces the sperm cells. Archegonia or archegonium, plural, archegonium singular, antheridia plural, antheridium singular. So archegonium is the one that produces the egg cells. Okay, so antheridia, sperm, archegonium, egg. Now this is where water comes in. Okay, water is required. Okay, specifically splashing of raindrops is required to transfer the sperm cell from the antheridia into the archegonia. Okay, that's why when it's rainy or very high moisture, we can see a lot of mosses around. So water will carry the sperm cell into the egg cell. Now at this point, everything is still in haploid gametophyte stage. Everything only has all the cells only has one copy of the chromosome set. However, once fertilization occurs, okay, we now enter the diploid sporophyte generation. Okay, because now we have two copies of the chromosome set. Half came from the egg, another half came from the sperm cell. Now that will produce this zygote. The fertilized egg grows by mitosis to form the embryonic sporophyte, which will become the embryo and eventually grow into this. So from this at the bottom, after fertilization, now there's the creation of the sporophyte body. Okay, so the mature sporophyte is an unbranched stalk with sporangium at its tip. So on its tip, you can find sporogenous cells, which within each sporangium, which will undergo mitosis to form the spore. So the sporophyte is the spore producing part of the plant. That's found on the tip. Okay, and then after meiosis, the spores will be released. Okay, okay, to form into the air, into the soil, to form the protonema. Now that protonema will now grow. So it's released from the tip, the spore. Then if it lands on the soil, that protonema will grow and become another gametophyte plant. Okay, so that's the life cycle of non-vascular plants. Gametophyte body here at the bottom. Antheridia are archegonia, sperm and egg, with the help of water, undergo fertilization to create this sporophyte. Okay, this sporophyte body. Okay, so at the tip of the sporophyte, it will create its spores. Once the spores mature and released, okay, so the spores will now be released from the capsule, and then when they land on the soil, they will grow into a protonema. The protonema will now grow into your gametophyte body. Okay, so that's how non-vascular plants reproduce. The next group of plants are your seedless vascular plants. So these are your ferns, club mosses, and horsetails, and whisk ferns. So we're quite familiar with ferns, no? We can see them. We're familiar with them. So these are your ferns, and these are your fronds, okay? The unraveled part of the fern. So then these are the fiddleheads. So these are the immature fern. Okay, so they will unravel once they mature. Then sori, plural of sorus. So these are the clumps. Okay, these are the clumps of spores on the underside of some ferns. For sure, you've seen them around. Okay, and if you actually zoom in, this is how they look like using a scanning electron microscope. This is how they look like. Okay, and then Perthallus, we will see this later. So this is the gametophyte generation of a fern, if you still remember gametophyte. So these are examples of ferns. So this one is a whisk fern. They have no roots or leaves. The green photosynthetic stems have yellow sporangia attached all over it. Okay, while here we have Equisetum telmatea. So this one is a species that forms two kinds of erect stems. One that is green, this is photosynthetic, and the other one is the spore-producing cone. Okay, mostly light brown. Okay. So let's look at the life cycle of your ferns and horsetails and club mosses. So here in a typical fern, that's a representative organism, both the gametophyte and sporophyte are photosynthetic and can actually live independently from each other. If you still remember in mosses, no, the sporophyte, the stalk, okay, the stalk is highly dependent on the gametophyte. But here, the gametophyte is actually an independent organism or independent body. Okay? Still, water is necessary for fertilization. So the gametes are released from the underside of the gametophyte, which is your prothallus, and swim in moist soil to neighboring gametophytes. Okay, so in this part, water is required, but for the dispersal of the spores from the underside of the fern, wind is the one that's required for that. Okay, so now here, for vascular plants, so this is the start of vascular plants, the dominant phase in their life cycle is the sporophyte. Unlike here in mosses, in non-vascular plants, the dominant phase is the gametophyte, this one. Okay, but in vascular plants, the dominant stage is this, the sporophyte or the spore producing part. Now let's look at the life cycle. Okay, let's start with number 1. Okay, so let's start with the release of the spore. So this is your typical fern. Okay, so this is the frond. This one is already unraveled. The fiddlehead, it's still curled up like that. So it will eventually mature and unravel like this. So on the underside of the frond, you can find your sori. Right, so those are clumps of spores or cluster of spores. So the fern sporophyte develops this reproductive structure on the underside of his leaves, okay, like this. And a sorus contains cluster, okay, again of sporangia. So this part is sporophyte, still sporophyte. So they are diploid cells. They have 2 copies of the chromosome set. Now the spores will undergo meiosis, okay, in which once they are released from the underside, okay, they will be carried by the wind. Okay, so once these are released from the underside, they will be carried by the wind, and then once they land on the soil, okay, each spore can germinate and develop into a prothallus or a fern gametophyte, and it looks like this. Okay. So it has roots like that, rhizoids. It has its antheridia and the actual prothallus body. Okay, so it will become like that, and then that can grow into this enlarged gametophyte, enlarged prothallus. Now, from the gametophyte, it has its 2 parts. Okay, it has an archegonium on this part. If it is a heart shape, no, in this part, in this section, and then from that archegonium, no, it will have this production of the egg cells. Now, the antheridium on the bottom part actually is responsible for the production of the sperm cells. Now, here, water is still necessary for fertilization. For the sperm cell to reach the egg cell, water is required. And all of these are happening while the plant is in its haploid gametophyte stage. All of this, they only have 1 copy of the chromosome set until fertilization occurs. Once the sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell, it will create a diploid zygote. Remember, half 23 egg, half sperm, 23. Now here, I mean, that's just assuming, no? But here, once they meet, they will have now the union of the egg cell and sperm cell to create a diploid zygote. Okay? Now, after that, it will grow and become your actual sporophyte, your actual fern body. And then the fern will now create the cluster of spores at the back of it, which will now return to the first part of the cycle. So let's consider this table that shows the gametophyte and sporophyte relationships in different plant groups. So we've seen mosses and non-vascular plants, and we know that their dominant phase or dominant stage is the gametophyte stage. Okay, so the gametophyte stage is the one that's most commonly seen, the one that's most obvious in their appearance, and the one that's most common for them. While they have sporophytes growing on top of their gametophytes, and their sporophytes are dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. For ferns, the one that we just talked a while ago, their dominant stage this time would be the sporophyte stage, okay? They have a gametophyte stage, the prothallus, but it is reduced, okay, quite small, independent, and photosynthetic and free living, quite detached from the sporophyte body. So for ferns and and seedless vascular plants, they now have the dominant sporophyte stage. Now for seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, they still continue having the dominant sporophyte body. Okay, so when you see a tree, that's the sporophyte stage. When you see a flowering plant, that's the sporophyte stage. Okay, they still have gametophytes, but these are usually microscopic. You will see it as we go along, dependent on the surrounding sporophyte tissue for nutrition. So among all the 3 major plant groups, it's only the non-vascular plants that have dominant gametophyte stage, while the rest have a dominant sporophyte stage. Now let's go to the next group. Those are your seed vascular plants or gymnosperms. These are your conifers, cycads, gnatophytes, and ginkgos. So in this diagram, we will be looking at the life cycle of a typical pine tree. Okay, we're familiar with that. So as we've mentioned, in seed vascular plants, the male and female gametophytes have been dramatically reduced in size. Okay, and the gametes are practically microscopic. So here, in this type of plants, the wind generally disperses the sperm that is within the male gametophyte, which bears the pollen. So in non-vascular plants and in seedless vascular plants, water is their primary means for fertilization. But here in gymnosperms, they now require wind as one of the major pollinating agents. Now, the pollen tube growth delivers the sperm. You will see that later here. Okay, so the pollen tube growth delivers the sperm to the egg in the female cone. That additional protection of the embryo is provided by the ovule, which develops into the seed coat. Okay, that's why they are considered seed vascular plants. They already have seeds. They no longer reproduce through spores, but they have seed, that protective structure for the embryo. So how do we consider this? Okay, so let's first start with the mature sporophyte. Okay, that's the one that we can visibly see. Okay, so when you see a pine tree, that's actually its sporophyte stage. So the sporophyte produces two types of cones, female and male cones. The female cone will give rise to the egg cell eventually. The male cones or your pollen cones will give rise to the pollens. Okay, so the cells here in the cones will undergo meiosis. So by the way, no, we started out with the sporophyte generation, with the diploid sporophyte generation. So they will undergo meiosis, okay, and the megasporocytes within the female cone will form, after going through meiosis, will form the megaspores. Okay, so the megaspores here. Well, the pine cone, the microsporocytes within the male cone will form the microspores here. Okay, from the microspores, they will develop into pollen. Okay, while the megaspores, so micro, smaller, no pollen, the megaspores will eventually give rise to the egg cell. Okay, egg cell of the plant. Um, so the microspore develops into a pollen, and then pollen grains are transferred to the female cone by the wind, as what we've mentioned. Okay, so they will enter the female megasporangium or the megasporangia. Okay, and then there will be fertilization here. The pollen tube transports the sperm cells, one of which fertilizes the egg. So um, the pollen tube here, okay, this is where the pollen was initially attached. Then the pollen tube will deliver the egg cell into the sperm cell into the egg cell here, so that fertilization will occur. So the sperm nucleus unites with the egg nucleus, and then it will develop into an embryo. Okay. Now this one is now your mature pollinated female cone. So it started out like this, but once it's pollinated, it turns like this. Now each individual scale here, each individual piece here is actually containing the seeds. Okay, seeds with papery wings. So once the female cone fully matures, the seeds will detach, and then the wind will carry them, okay, containing the seed, and then when they land on a soil, okay, they can undergo germination and grow into another mature sporophyte pine tree. Okay, so again, diploid sporophyte generation, the pine tree, it has male and female cone. The female cone will eventually give rise to the egg cell. The male cone will eventually give rise to the pollen. Then through pollination here, the pollen tube will bring the sperm cell into the egg cell for fertilization to occur. Then the female cone will mature. All of these scales will become seeds with their papery wings. Then once they detach, they are carried off by the wind. Once they land on the soil, they germinate and grow into another pine tree. Okay, so as you can see, the seeds here are quite naked. They are not protected by a fruit. That's why they're called gymnosperms. It means naked seeds. Okay, the seeds are exposed. Now, if you're wondering if this looks familiar, because this is what we use to decorate our Christmas tree, when it's Christmas time. Okay, it's those are literally pine cones. Those are literally reproductive structures um, of those Christmas trees. Okay. Now, these are representative structures. The giant sequoia tree in California, Sequoia National Park. This is the biggest tree in the world. Okay, is an example of a gymnosperm. It is one of the largest living organism and the most ancient organisms in our planet. Then we also have cycads, they look like this, gnetophytes, they look like this, and then ginkgos. These are all representative organisms of gymnosperms. Now, before we go to angiosperms, I recommend that you watch this video from Amoeba Sisters entitled Flower Reproduction in Angiosperms. I'll provide the link in the description below. Now let's look at the life cycle of seed vascular plants. We call them angiosperms, and the representative organisms are your monocots and dicots. So similar with pines or gymnosperms, water is no longer required for fertilization in angiosperms. Um, so a significant feature of angiosperms is double fertilization, in which one sperm cell unites with the egg cell to form the zygote, while the other sperm cells unite with the polar nuclei, okay, to form the triploid cell that gives rise to the endosperm that eventually creates the seed of that plant, okay? So in most species of angiosperms, animals are the ones who carry the pollen to the carpel, okay? Animals are the agents, are one of the agents of pollination. So the outer wall of the carpel forms the fruit. The outer wall of the carpel forms the fruit that entices the animals to consume the fruit and to disperse the seed. So we will see more of this later. So let's start off with the mature sporophyte of angiosperms. Okay, so similar with gymnosperms, sporophyte is their dominant life stage. Okay, so that's diploid generation. Okay, so from the sporophyte, no, angiosperms create their flowers. Okay, which produce angiosperms create from their mature sporophyte, they produce the flowers, which is their reproductive structure. So the megasporocyte is the one that will eventually give rise to the egg cell, while the microsporocytes, similar to gymnosperms, no, will eventually give rise to the pollen. So the megaspore undergoes meiosis to form, at this point, haploid megaspores, which will then develop into the egg nucleus. The microsporocytes will undergo meiosis to become haploid pollen, okay? Haploid pollen grains, okay? So in the process of pollination, that pollen will land on the female part of the flower, okay? And the developing pollen tube will bring the egg cell into the sperm cell into the egg cell, okay, for fertilization to take place. So again, we have two fertilization here, one to form the zygote and the other one to form the endosperm. So at this point, we're back to, so at this point, all of these are haploid cells, okay. At this point, we're back to diploid sporophyte generation. So double fertilization occurs, resulting into a diploid zygote with a triploid endosperm surrounding it. So when this seed when the seed inside the fruit was eaten by for example by animals, and they were defecated on the soil, this seed will germinate and become a seedling, which will grow into a mature sporophyte. Okay, so sporophyte with again, no, sporophyte with the flower. The megasporocyte will give rise to the egg. The microsporocyte will give rise to the pollen. So in the process of pollination, the sperm cell is brought into the egg cell, okay, wherein double fertilization will occur to fertilize the egg and to create the endosperm. Now, the endosperm will be enclosed in that fruit. then that fruit, when eaten by animals, and then defecated on the soil, will give rise to the new seedling, which will grow into another sporophyte. How do animals reproduce sexually? So these are the two main types of sexual reproduction in animals. The first is external fertilization, and the other one is internal fertilization. In external fertilization, the union of the sperm and egg happens outside the male and female bodies. Okay, so usually this is performed by fish and some amphibians, okay, wherein the union of egg and sperm happens within the water, okay. Um, so here we have an example of frogs depositing large quantities of sperm and eggs into the water where they could be fertilized, okay? Now, the other type of sexual reproduction in animals is internal fertilization. So here, the union of egg cell and sperm cell happens typically within the female reproductive system, okay? And that is where the zygote will grow, and so that occurs during pregnancy. The zygote will grow into embryo, into fetus, and then eventually the female will give birth. So these are the two types of sexual reproduction in animals. So we have here more photos. So external fertilization. Okay, so this happens again, no, in species of amphibians and fish. Okay, so what they do is they release thousands and thousands of egg cells, the female, while the male releases thousands and thousands, even millions of sperm cells into the water, then hoping that, okay, a lot of those will become fertilized. Okay, the sperm cells will fertilize the egg cell. Okay, so in most of these species, behavioral adaptations ensure that the male is present when the female releases her eggs. Okay, so we see here the female is the one on the bottom releasing mass of eggs, while the male is releasing also at the same time the sperm cells. And sometimes, you know, the males will squeeze the female's body to push the egg out of her body. So the union of the egg cell and sperm cell typically occurs in the water. We see here adult rockhopper penguins, okay, on a nesting site. So here, what happens here is that the union of egg cell and sperm cell happens within the female body, but the egg is laid out, and the development of the offspring happens outside the female body. So once the egg hatches, that's when the offspring is visible, and then the parents could take care of them. Okay. Now, these are other modes of reproduction, okay, of in mammals, specifically in mammals. So we're familiar with monotremes, okay. So they lay eggs, as we can see here in a platypus. So we have egg-laying mammals, such as the platypus. So ayun, so the offspring here are newly hatched from their eggs, okay, and then they're taken care of by their parents, okay? Then we also have some monotremes, egg-laying mammals. We have marsupials. So this one is an example of a red kangaroo, okay, Macropus rufus. So they give birth to very, very small offspring in comparison to their actual body. And then the offspring actually grows within the pouch, okay, within the pouch of the mother. So they give birth to very, very small organism, very, very small offspring. They just grow and mature inside their mother's pouch. And then very typical, you have your placental mammals such as humans, okay? So here, the young remain inside the mother's uterus for a longer period of time, and they are born later, okay, when they're almost fully, almost developed, okay, almost capable of surviving on their own. And the reason why they're called placentals is because during the pregnancy, they're connected to their mothers through a placenta. That's how the mother nourishes the growing baby inside its body. Now let's look at advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. So in terms of advantages now, from humans' perspective, we were able to utilize sexual reproduction to develop many types of plants and animals that have desirable traits. So we call that process selective breeding. Okay, so through selective breeding or artificial selection, our ancestors were able to domesticate, for example, wild boars into domesticated pig, from wolves into domesticated dogs, from the ancestors of um, unedible plants, right, or fruits, into what we have today. So, in terms of agriculture and farming, humans have utilized sexual reproduction to create better plants and larger animals. Okay. Again, I've mentioned we've used selective breeding to create desirable pets. Okay, so the different breeds of dogs and cats that we have now. Okay. Now, in terms of disadvantages, no, okay, we've mentioned that in sexual reproduction, it needs two parents to contribute the genetic material. So aside from that, organisms have to grow and develop until they are old enough to produce sex cells. So they have to reach sexual maturity before they can reproduce. Another thing is that searching for a mate can expose individuals to predators, diseases, or harsh environmental conditions. Okay, so for some animals, for example, such as salmon, okay, right after they reproduce, they usually die, okay, in the river in which they consider their breeding grounds. So sometimes, even the act of reproduction actually results into the death of an organism. Another disadvantage is that fertilization cannot take place during pregnancy. So for some mammals, such as elephants, that could last for as long as 2 years. So no fertilization, no offspring can be produced during the length of time of pregnancy. So other advantages and disadvantages. So this one is in comparison, okay? Comparing sexual and asexual reproduction. So again, disadvantages of asexual reproduction. With a changing environment, individuals producing genetically diverse offspring are more likely to have offspring suited to the environment. But since in asexual reproduction, they all share the same genetic information, so this lowers their chance of surviving in their environment. However, the reproduction is fast and is efficient since we only have one parent, and all of individual alleles, okay, if those are desirable and allows them to survive, all of their genetic materials are passed on to their offspring. Now, in comparison to sexual reproduction, the disadvantages we've mentioned, that finding a partner and mating can be difficult and time consuming, okay? You have to perform all these mating rituals in order to lead to actual mating, okay? Only half of an individual alleles will be passed on to its offspring. So we've all mentioned that with our sex cells being haploid cells or having just one copy of the genetic material. While the advantages include offspring are genetically different from each other. So these are offspring of this parent, okay, and then another parent as well, but they are quite different from each other, okay? That genetic diversity among offspring can be an evolutionary adaptation. Again, I've mentioned that sexual reproduction is a driving force of evolution. So because of that genetic diversity, it increases the fitness of that species in its changing environment. It allows them to actually survive in their changing environment. So more comparison of asexual and sexual reproduction asexual reproduction does not require special cells. So it just happens within the body of the parent cell. Can produce offspring very quickly, okay? Creates large and thriving population within as long as they're within a stable environment. So disadvantage, limited ability to adapt and could face massive die-off. Okay, they could die off, all of them. They could be extinct right away if the environment changes. While in sexual reproduction, there are lots of variation within a species since there are two parents contributing their genetic material. This allows them to live in a variety of environmental settings. Okay, since with their variation, allowing them to do that. And this allows them to adapt to changes in the environment. So again, a driving force of evolution. sexual reproduction needs time and energy to perform, so that's their disadvantage, and they can only produce small population. Now, if you want to learn more about the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction, as well as the representative organisms who perform them, I recommend that you visit this from learn.genetics, an interactive site about this topic. I'll provide the link in the description below. Now, this one is an interesting video from TED-Ed, the last living members of an extinct species. So you could actually check it out and see how we can actually push the limits of sexual reproduction and on the other disadvantages that it presents to us. Okay, so I'll provide the link in the description below. For your reflective journal log, after seeing the comparison between asexual and sexual reproductions, why don't humans reproduce asexually? So I recommend that you watch this video, linked in the description below. That ends our video. I hope you learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. Till next time, goodbye.